This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the True Crime Arizona podcast, the Zombie Hunter trial. This is a really important update today. We have big developments and a lot to go over. I'm your host, Briana Whitney, and with me here is Morgan Lowe, our investigative reporter at Arizona's Family.
Hi there.
Okay, let's jump right in. We had closing arguments this week, which is what we predicted in the last episode. And among other things, that means we're going to have a verdict very soon. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first, Morgan, get us up to speed on how this past week went and the closing arguments that played out.
Yeah, so we started the week with more testimony from Amy Miller, Bryan's ex-wife. She was the final witness, and she ended by basically telling the court that by the time of her divorce, she was afraid of Bryan. Then the judge, the prosecutors, and the defense hammered out the schedule for closing arguments. It would take 1 to 2 days. The prosecution would go first, then the defense, then the prosecution would get a rebuttal, the final say, and then the judge would get the case, and that is what happened.
So let's break down some of what was said, starting with the prosecution's closing argument since they were up first. Elizabeth Reamer spoke for the state, and she sat second chair during the trial. She started out by saying that the evidence is clear that Bryan Miller planned and prepared for both killings. That's an important part. She went through the charges: first-degree murder of both Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness, kidnapping and sexual assault, and attempted sexual assault. Now, the challenge for the prosecution is not to establish that Miller committed these acts. It's to establish that he was sane when he committed these acts. Here's a clip of how prosecutor Elizabeth Reamer began to make that case.
I think humans want to believe that only someone completely insane would do this. That a body in that condition would only be that damaged, that mutilated, that destroyed by someone that has such incredible mental health issues, such severe mental health concern, that has to be why someone would do this. Your Honor, this entire trial proves that that's not true. Someone who has some mental health concerns, maybe some diagnoses, but not someone who was diagnosed as all these really scary things that make them so vicious and dangerous. That's not what we have here. What we have is a man who wants to be violent with women, who wants to mutilate them and have sex with them, who did this. This isn't about mental health. This isn't about insanity. Instead, it's about a man who made choices to go on canals with knives and wait for an opportunity. And unfortunately for next of kin, he found 2 of those.
Okay, so Morgan, coming off that soundbite, especially when it comes to the mental health argument of this, what did you notice that she was trying to set up and push a point to the judge?
This was interesting because we think of trials, what we see on TV, where it's played out like a narrative and the witnesses, there's this climax and they really make their cases, and that's not what happens in real life. Witness testimony is often really dry. However, the closing arguments, they really did come off as dramatic. And in this case, Elizabeth Reamer starts out with saying, you want to believe that only an insane person could do this, and that it would take somebody who's insane to do what he did to these women, to their bodies. But that's not what we have here. She really did an effective job of taking the listener, in this case, the judge, the trier of fact, and saying, I know this is what you want to believe, but that's not what we have here. And she really, at that point, set out to establish that Bryan Miller did what he did because he wanted to, not because he was compelled to do it due to some pre-existing insanity.
Something I noticed from her specifically, bringing up the fact that after Angela and Melanie were killed. Angela was decapitated, and there was an attempt to conceal her body. And Melanie Burness was actually dressed in other clothes, like to redress her after the killing. And Elizabeth hammering home that is somebody who knew what they did was wrong and was trying to cover up the crimes they did.
Yeah, why would you try to cover it up? Why would you try to conceal it? Why would you try to hide the evidence if you didn't know that was wrong? That was a key point that the prosecution came back to again and again and again. And they admitted that Miller might have had some mental issues, some mental health issues, but not to the extent that is required by law to establish insanity.
And that really goes to the prosecution's full point. And I think, too, they also were showing that he had a pattern of showing violence against women, that's what he wanted. He liked that. He desired that. You heard Amy testify about it as well. And that's something that turned him on.
Yeah, and what they had was his own words, because he wrote Amy these letters from jail when he was in Washington. And these letters talked about what he wanted sexually, the sexual sadistic actions and activities that he wanted. And I was sitting in court listening to them talk about these, and I was knowing that Amy Miller's past since the divorce. She has not lived a stable life. She was basically homeless for a while. It was not what we would consider a normal life. And I was thinking, how did she save these letters? And I don't know if they got the letters from her or if they got them from the jail in Washington, because when inmates get and receive letters, oftentimes the authorities make copies of it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So that's just sort of an aside, a tangent here. But the result is, however they got them, they had Miller's own writing, and they were able to use those words pretty effectively against him. They also had, and they referenced numerous times in closings, the plan, that story that he wrote when he was a teenager about what he wanted to do, his sort of fantasy of abducting and raping and killing a young woman. And they used that as they talked before about evidence of his intent ahead of time, his planning. And their argument is, if he was insane, he wouldn't be planning this out. He wouldn't be carefully planning it, then concealing it, as you said.
And I think what strikes me about the plan and these letters, too, is, just in this day and age, right? If you're talking about something and you want it to be on record, you put it in writing. Same thing goes for if you don't want something out there, right? It's only a he said, she said if Amy's testifying and, Brian confessed to these things. And that is good testimony. But to actually have him, the hard evidence in writing that he had the intent or expressed the interest and desire to do these things, I think that those letters and the plan are some of the most damning pieces of evidence in this trial that would work in the prosecution's favor.
Yeah, and just as you were saying that, I was sort of going back in my mind to watching the prosecutor take one of these letters from the stack of evidence and taking it over and putting it in a file. And it did look like an original letter. It looked like it had been written out. It wasn't a copy. So it is interesting that they had these, and certainly that helped with their prosecution, with their case. Now, one of the things that Elizabeth Reamer did was target the defense experts, the ones who testified that they believe Miller was legally insane, that he suffered from dissociation disorder and autism, among other mental health issues. And Reamer really criticized the main defense psychologist, Dr. Mark Cunningham, basically accusing him of pushing junk science.
It is clear that he caters to juries by using large words and run-on sentences to create a facade of substance. The jury instructions tell Your Honor not to put aside common sense, and I know that you won't. Putting aside common sense is what is required to believe that Dr. Cunningham's testimony or any of the other defense experts' testimony equal clear and convincing evidence that this defendant did not know right from wrong, that he did not know what he was doing, and that he was legally insane at the time.
So she really went all in on Dr. Cunningham, who was somebody who testified quite a bit in this trial. He played a big part. He also had a lot to do with having conversation with Bryan and observing Bryan. Do you think she went too far with that criticism?
Yeah, that's something that I was wondering, because it almost got personal. And I understand, the tactic of wanting to make your point that we are so right that you shouldn't even listen to the other side. And that's really what they were doing here, was saying that we are so correct, we are so much on the side of established science that what the other side was saying is garbage. It's nothing that even makes sense. And I don't know if a judge, being the trier of fact, would sort of take that badly. Maybe if it was a jury, you might have some jurors who might be sympathetic to the other side, who might say, wait a second, you've gone overboard a little bit. I think what the prosecution's tactic here with listening to these closings is that this is a cut and dry case. He planned it. He did it because he enjoyed it, and there is no evidence by any established science that he was insane under the law at the time of the murders. And I really think that they just came in sort of with a flamethrower in these closing arguments and just said, that's it. We're just clearing everything away that the other side said. And clearly they were not happy to hear that.
No. So Elizabeth Reamer took a little more than an hour to get through her closing arguments. The court then broke for lunch, and then the defense got its chance to make its final pitch.
R.J. Parker handled closings for the defense. You could tell he was annoyed at the way the prosecution described his key witness. I will tell you that after all of these months of listening to the defense witnesses describe these complex psychological disorders, none of those psychologists did as an effective a job as R.J. Parker did. Now, whether you believe what he was saying or not, he was able to put these complex scientific theories into words and sentences where they were easy to understand. Let's start with how he began his closings.
I want to start by saying there is no doubt that what the families in this case must be experiencing is unimaginable. The offenses in this case, they're tragic, they are heartbreaking, and they are devastating. And we're going to have to talk about some difficult facts today, so I apologize in advance. A part of Bryan, one that he lacks full access to, is absolutely responsible for the offenses. Like we said from the beginning, the Bryan who is sitting here in the courtroom today, the shy, quiet, awkward, sometimes goofy individual, is not the same Bryan who committed these offenses.
It was a little tough to hear there because he stepped away from the mic, but R.J. Parker stated outright that Bryan Miller is responsible for these offenses. Right there. He did it, but it wasn't really him. What do you think? I mean, I think that it was a novel approach, but Parker really came across as empathetic and likable. You could tell he's used to talking to juries because he started out by saying, let's just start out, this is going to be uncomfortable and this is terrible for the victims. So I think that is obviously a sign of a seasoned litigator, a seasoned attorney.
Sure.
But he did start out very well, coming off as likable.
I thought so too. And I think where I question here is it did make sense what he was breaking down. And we had talked about how many weeks and weeks, if not months, there was of that complex scientific testimony that's hard for anybody to digest. Was that too late though? I mean, these doctors have been on the stand. This is what the judge has been listening to. Has she already thought about things in her mind? And RJ Parker hammering that home in the best way possible, it's either really effective and it's going to make a mark on Suzanne Cohen, the judge, or too little too late.
Yeah. Well, it's the end and it's his last chance. So he really did his best to describe Bryan as a victim of his mother's abuse. And he spent a lot of time talking in detail about what that abuse consisted of. Physical abuse, mental abuse. He said that she said things to him, "I wish you were aborted." These things that mothers should never say to their kids. He talked about the sexualization. She would apparently walk around in outfits and negligee that maybe would be inappropriate in front of a young boy, sexualizing him, threatening, we heard over and over again, to cut off his penis with a pair of scissors. And they also talked about these movies that they said that she watched with him, Faces of Death and Shocking Asia. And those came up over and over and over again. And I want to say here, as a person who grew up in the late 70s and early 80s, I'd never heard of Shocking Asia, but Faces of Death was one of those sort of cult movies that teenagers, would get a copy of and watched. And I saw Faces of Death as a high school kid. It's one of these sort of pseudo fake documentaries that was all about how people, what people and creatures and animals experience when they died. It was a little odd listening to a movie like that was obviously, it's a terrible movie, but something that a lot of kids saw and treating it like it was this event, this experience that would really turn somebody's life in a totally different direction. I understand that lots of people experience things in media a different way, but I was a pretty normal kid with other normal kids, and this was just one of those movies that they threw around and watched. And so that's just sort of a personal point there that I was listening to what they were talking about, and it just, as a neutral observer, it sort of struck me as, I don't know if they're putting too much weight on a movie. Obviously, there were more things that were going on with Bryan Miller. They're saying that the abuse came at a time where his brain was developing, and then it also came at a time where he had these mental illnesses, autism, that were starting to develop. And so all of this combined to create the person that it created. And obviously, these things did happen to him, and they did change him, because he became this teenager who they admitted, became a murderer. It's just why is why there is what is at issue here.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside perspective, and I know you were in court, and I was watching some of this back in the newsroom. To me, it seems like their strongest argument here is the sexual abuse from his mom to him. I mean, and I heard him mention multiple times the threatening to cut off his penis. Mm-hmm. And his point was, I mean, what is a child supposed to do in that instance when that's being threatened? I mean, that's a horrible thing. I think that was their most effective argument, in that, this was shaping Bryan negatively from the start, almost like he was doomed and didn't have a chance to normally develop, maturely develop. But I agree with you on the movie part. Kids watch movies that are maybe too violent or too sexual in nature at a young age all the time.
Right.
I mean that, and most kids don't grow up to then kill violently to women. So I'm with you on that. I don't know if that really would make such a difference with this judge. And this judge seems pretty no nonsense too. I mean, very seasoned as well. would that really affect her? Not sure.
Right. So the other thing that was really effective about what R.J. Parker did is we have heard these phrases, dissociative disorder and all of these other really clinical psychological phrases. But Parker did something in the closings that I just thought maybe should have done more and more often leading up to this, and that is introducing the idea that there were two Bryans. He really hammered home this idea that all of this psychological trauma fractured his psyche into two. There was a normal state and a trauma state. And the way he described it was that the normal state was there dealing with everyday life, and then when things would build up and the pressure came out, this trauma state, I guess you could kind of think of it as like Bryan Miller's evil twin, would burst out, and the trauma state is what stabbed Celeste Bentley. That was an outburst of that. And the trauma state is what killed Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis and did these terrible things. And Parker spent a lot of time talking about the science behind a normal state and a trauma state, what led to it, what could lead to it. The question is that going to be something that the judge buys?
Yeah, I mean, that is a tough sell for the defense to actually convince the judge that Bryan was so damaged that as a child, and then when he became older, his psyche split into two different people. I mean, that's a tough defense for anybody to really comprehend. So you want to listen to how R.J. Parker explained it to Judge Cohen. Here's more of that.
What you start to see is a dissociated self. That's where you start to get threats that are more compartmentalized and the access becomes less readily accessible, and then you have the normal state. And you've heard a lot of testimony about the two different states. So when I tell you that the Bryan sitting here in the courtroom is not the Bryan who committed these offenses, you know what we're talking about is that Bryan has disruptions that are so severe, they fractured his consciousness and split him into, he has two self states, one for managing the stuff that we don't want to deal with, and one for living his life.
So Parker went even so far as to say that it was possible for the trauma state, this evil twin, to plan out crimes while the normal state, the normal person, didn't know anything about it. And he stood there, I mean, his closings went on for hours, and he hammered this idea home, this psychological theory that it is possible to have two different people in there. And we've heard of this before, but was there enough to establish that that is what was happening with Bryan? And that's the question.
And also, does a split personality make you insane legally? I mean, somebody could have, a split personality, but they may not be diagnosed as legally insane.
Right, because I think people think, if somebody's insane, you think of your definition of insane.
Sure.
And that's not the legal standard. The
No.
legal standard of not understanding the nature and consequences of what they did, whether it was right or wrong. And that's different from thinking of somebody as insane. And you could say, so-and-so has two personalities. So-and-so's bipolar. They have two personalities. That's insane. That's not legally insane.
Right. It might be, in slang terms of insane, we might use that in everyday conversation, but this is all going back to what is legally deemed insane. And what I find really interesting about that is, okay, let's buy R.J. Parker's theory here that there's two Bryans and that the Bryan in a trauma state that is planning these crimes, the normal state of Bryan doesn't know he's doing it. But what about after the crime? So if he's committing this in a trauma state, does he just snap back to a normal state and never remember it again?
Yeah, and that is something that the prosecution brought up. They said, okay, so the defense says that it's possible for the trauma state to plan the crime and carry it out. The prosecution said, still, afterwards, there was evidence that he tried to cover it up. And the trauma state, the goal of the trauma state is to commit this act. It's not necessarily to get away with it. That's a rational thought, to get away with it. What do I need to do to not get caught? And there was nothing that the defense talked about that would explain what happens afterwards, just like you said. So that does appear to be a little bit of a hole, a gaping hole in their argument.
Yeah, a little hole, but a big hole in something like this. And I think it opens a can of worms too, right? If you're going to look at it that way on the front end of it, well, how about during, how about after, and then years after too? I mean, it all has to kind of add up. And I don't know if it does. I mean, that's going to be up to the judge.
This is certainly a tough case for the defense. When you have to start your closing arguments by saying, we understand that the person sitting there did it, but go with me for a second here and think maybe it was him, but it wasn't him. And that's where they had to start. And that is their best argument to get their client either found not guilty by reason of insanity or kept off of death row. The prosecution had a much more clear-cut argument. There was planning. We have evidence that shows that he did it because he wanted to do it, that he enjoyed it, and we're going to attack their idea of what insanity is and whether it was apparent in this person.
One thing, too, is I feel like when we talk about a murder trial like this, typically I feel like we would be looking at DNA evidence as some of the most important evidence in the case, right? If this DNA is there, that puts him at the crime scene, we're looking at that. And that is not the most important evidence in this case because you have both sides saying, well, he was there, he did it. We know he did it. His semen was on these women. I mean, that is hugely detrimental against Bryan, and it normally would be if they were going for he didn't do these crimes. But because that has not been the through line of this case, it almost becomes like we're not even talking about the DNA evidence much because that's not even what the prosecution is trying to prove.
Yeah, the prosecutor spent probably 5 to 7 minutes out of that hour and 15 minutes just briefly going through the DNA. But the defense didn't attack the DNA at all in their closings. I mean, they are focused on this. They were pretty focused in their arguments. There's 2 of him. It was caused by trauma, and that this is something that's established and that you can't, I guess, legally punish him because this means he's insane.
Yeah, just very, very interesting. And I think the fact that the defense during their closing arguments went on hours longer than the prosecution just shows how much more they have to prove to the judge to try to get a not guilty by reason of insanity. So it's interesting. And now Judge Suzanne Cohen has the case. She says she is going to look over the evidence and the witness testimony in the jury room, just as a jury would, by herself, and then she will render her verdict when she makes up her mind. The earliest we expect that is Tuesday, April 11th. It really could come this week. And we will all get an alert from the prosecution and the defense when Judge Cohen is ready for that. And then we will notify everybody from there. And we are planning to do an emergency podcast release the day that the verdict comes in to let all of you know what happens, because there are 2 real different outcomes that could come of this. And if he is guilty, then we're heading into a lot more testimony from both sides, but the defense already said that they would bring in at least 26 witnesses in the penalty phase.
At least 3 weeks of testimony from the defense. Will that start immediately? We're not sure. The judge sort of indicated that they were going to go right into it. I don't know if that means like the next day or in a few days. We'll see. Some of this is uncharted water. They also said at the end of this, sort of, when they weren't taking testimony, sometimes there are some more lighthearted exchanges. And one of them wondered if this was the longest bench trial
in Arizona history
for a murder case. And I don't know that it is or it isn't, but just the fact that they're sort of all acknowledging that this has gone on and on and may still go on for another month. That's interesting.
It is, especially when you think it started in the fall. We've gone through the winter. We're now into spring, and we will be heading into summer shortly here in Arizona. So, I mean, when you look at it like that, too, this has truly spanned the seasons. And that is a long time to be in a courtroom processing all of this. So that's what we have to deal with Judge Cohen. Will she take a lot of time going over all of this because it's been a long time? Or does she pretty much know how she feels? She's going to review everything and come back. We could very likely get a verdict this week, once you're listening to this podcast this week, and we will bring you the very latest as it unfolds. Thank you, everybody, for staying along with us. We know it's been a lot of months. We're doing our best to break down as we learn, and now you've got all of the information in the closing arguments. So the next podcast, we'll have a verdict for you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.